All right, good evening. We're learning Maseches Eruvin, Daf Tzadi Beis. And we're starting on the very last line of Daf Tzadi Aleph Amud Beis at Amar Le Ravina Le Ravashi. For historical context, we know that Ravina and Ravashi were the very last generation of the Amoraim. They were the ones that edited the Gemara into the form that had Mishnayos and Brises and Toseftas and isolated statements of Amoraim. A lot of the Shakla Vitaria that we now know of, like the Mahudatemas, the Tzrichas, all of that was actually added later, according to many Rishonim. So here, just recognize that we are hundreds of years after Rav Yochanan. So the Gemara says, Amar le Ravina le Ravashi, mi Amar Rav Yochanan hachi. Could you imagine a debate going on for hundreds of years? Did that one Rav say that one line? There's like a famous sheet on the Kolbo in Hilchos Shabbos, that the Kolbo says that if you're Megis, it's an Isser Daraisa, just stirring a food that's already Mavushal. Let's say it makes it into the Shulchan Aruch. It's a real shita. For however long it's been since the Kolbo, everyone is tearing it apart. What did he mean? How could it be? A double covering on the head. There's a Bal Ha'ita writes this. Was he talking about Kisvi Rosh? Was he talking about Tefillah? Is tearing it apart? This is hundreds of years later. They're trying to figure out Rav Yochanan. What Rav Yochanan? So Rashi tells us what Rav Yochanan. This is the one that we learned yesterday. Rashi Dibur Hamaschal Yom Rav Yochanan Hachi Halacha Kerab Shimon Ve'afilu Irvu. He says that where the halacha is like Rav Shimon. What were we talking about? The name of the parak, Kol Gagos. You can walk on any roof, any karpef, any chatzir you want from one to the next fluid, no problem, even if there is an eruv. So that's what Rashi is saying here. Rashi says that does Rav Yochanan really say that way? Why would it seem that Rav Yochanan does not say that way? Because of the top line of Tzadi Beis Amud Aleph. We know, and we've seen this many times in our Masechta already, that Rav Yochanan holds like a Stam Mishnah. Vitnan, and we have a Stam Mishnah here in this Masechta, the name of a parak Kosel. Vitnan, Kosel shebein shtei chatzeres gvua asar barochav arba. If there's a wall that separates my chatzer from your chatzer, and the wall is 10 tvachim tall and 4 tvachim wide, so it is mamish its own rishus, it separates us properly. So the halacha is ma'arvin shnayim ve'in ma'arvin echad. The halacha is that under those circumstances, you have to make an eruv separately. You have to make an eruv separately. The wall is too distinct. But what about going on top of that wall? So says the Gemara, quoting that Mishnah, Hayu Barosho Peros. So if on top there were fruits on top of that wall, again, my chatzer, your chatzer, in between me and you is a wall that's 10 tvachim tall by 4 tvachim wide, and there's fruits on top. So what does the Mishnah say? Elu olin mikan ve'ochlin, ve'elu olin mikan ve'ochlin. The din is that I can go climb up on that wall, sit down and eat, and you can do the same on your side. Ubilvad shelo yuridu lamata. And that's only true if you don't bring the food down. What does that imply in that case? That there's no eruv, because if there was an eruv between those two rishuyos, you could bring it down. So Rav Yochanan, if the halacha is like a Stam Mishnah, well, this is a Stam Mishnah, and we see that there's no eruv in this case, where the fact that you're not allowed to bring the food down. So the Gemara here responds and says that's not a good argument. Rav Yochanan can still hold his shita within Reb Shimon. How so? Because my lamata. What does the Mishnah mean when it says lamata, that you're not allowed to go down from the wall? It could be that their taka was an eruv, but lamata meant libatin. You can't take the food from the wall into your chatzar. Maybe there was an eruv between your wall and the chatzar. Maybe that's possible. It's its own rishus. You can make an eruv between the two places. That's possible. But what you cannot do is bring it into your house. So asks the Gemara, but wait a minute. He adds another layer of stringency beyond what the actual Mishnah writes. So I don't understand. What about Reb Chia? Says the Gemara, Amar Le, no, that is not a good argument either. Rebbe lo shana. Rebbe did not teach it that way. Reb Chia minayin lo. Where does he get that from? And so in other words, we're looking at the text of the Mishnah of Reb Yehuda Nasi. The text of the Mishnah of Rebbe was ubilvad shelo yuridu lamata. Therefore, Rav Yochanan can hold on to his opinion. What was his opinion again? That within the world of Reb Shimon, who says that all of the chatzeros and karfefios and all the gagos, they're all one unit, no problem, mutar v'mutar. And it's true even if you make an eruv. Good. 1/3 of the way down, Tzadi Beis Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara as follows. Itmar, we have a statement from the Amoraim. Shtei chatzeros v'churva achas beinehem. There's 3 properties. There's my chatzer, there's a churva, and then there's your chatzer. So my chatzer, a damaged property, it's technically a place where someone could live, but nobody lives there now. So it's my property, my chatzer, a churva, and then your chatzer. So says the Gemara as follows: Achas irba va'achas lo irba. Let's say that I was me'arev and you are not me'arev. So then who do we give the churva to? We spoke about this type of preferential giving of spaces. Remember yesterday we referenced this Gemara yet again, that if you have someone who lives in a yard and someone who lives on the porch, Well, if the item is above 10 tvachim, we give access to the person who's has more of an easy access. We spoke about this a number of times in the Masechta already. So how would it work here? Two people, one was ma'ariv, one was not. Who gets the churba? That's a machlokas amoraim. Amar Rav Huna, nosnen osel l'zushelo irva. We give it to the person who did not make an eruv. Aval l'she'irva lo. But the person who made an eruv, we do not give him access to the churba. Why not? Wouldn't you have thought an eruv is better? Right? You thought an eruv is better. So it says the Gemara, why would that be the case? If you make an eruv, you don't get access to the churba. Why? Because since you made an eruv and you can carry from your house into your chatzer, we're afraid that you may also carry from your chatzer into the churba, which is not allowed. That's one step too far. So therefore, you have access to the churba, and you can carry within the churba, but you can't bring stuff from your chatzar to the churba. So it's safer bet, says Rav Huna, to give it to someone who is not me'ariv. He's less likely to violate the isser of carrying something from inside his house into the chatzar, into the churba.
Yeah, but you have an eruv, you can do it anyway.
You don't have an eruv into the churba. You have an eruv for your own chatzar.
And that's not including the
right,
churba?
Not including the churba. Exactly right.
I'll make it around.
Yeah, you could have been me'ariv that way, but that's not the case. It's just not the mitzvah here. But that's how the Gemara answers. Don't worry, the Gemara rejects this in a different way. It doesn't reject Rav Chia, it doesn't reject Rav Huna, but it has another approach that we'll spend a little bit of time on until we get to the next Mishnah. What does this second answer look like? This is almost halfway down. V'chia bar Rav Amar af l'she'irva. It even can be given to the person who made an eruv. V'shtehen asuros. He actually argues against the first version. He says Rav Huna says that one person can have access to the churba. So here, Rav Chia says, first of all, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no preferential treatment between the two. And second of all, shtein asuros. No one's allowed to use the churba in this case. So if it's chatzer, churba, chatzer, Rav Chia bar Rav says no one's allowed to use it at all. And how do I know that shtein asuros? Maybe it could have been shtein mutaros. Why is it that we're saying that in the case of chatzer, churba, chatzer, that we're saying that it's going to be usher access for both? Because because had it been that it was mutter for both people to access, then what would have been the case? Why then, had it been that it was mutter, then why would it not then have been the case that the chatzar shelo irva should have been able to give to the chatzar shirva? This is a case where you have two chatzeros, one next to the other. If it's mutter to one another, in such a case, there should have been mutter to move things throughout. So we see that that's not the case. So how does the Gemara answer this? The Gemara says, Hasam, in that case, when you only have two chatzeros with no churba, kevan dimintere mani debatim b'chatzer asi la'afuke. Since people who have a chatzer in a house could keep items from their chatzer in their house, we're therefore concerned that you may have moved them from one chatzer to another. Hacha b'churva, but here, when it comes to a churva, kevan delo mintere mani de chatzer b'churva lo asi la'afuke. We would never be concerned that someone would bring their items hacha bechurba, here in the case of bechurba, kaven delo mintre mani the chatzer bechurba, since people would not leave items on their own in the churba, therefore we're not concerned about that, and that's how Chia bar Rav proves that it must be a case of shtein asuros. Here's a second version of Chia bar Rav. Ika de amre Chia bar Rav amar af l'she'irva. Really, he disagrees with Rav Huna, and really, technically, the property could have been preferential to anybody. However, ushtehen mutaros. Here he gives the opposite frame, that really, when it's a case of chatzer, churva, chatzer, he says that everyone's allowed access. Maybe we should say that it should have been usher and not mutter. Why would we have said that it's usher? Because we see when you have two chatzeros, one next to the other, that they don't transfer reshuyos. Says the Gemara, Hasam over there, since people will put stuff in their chatzer, so we were concerned about that case. But people don't leave their items in a churba. So all of this is to summarize that case, and the conclusion of the Gemara is a machlokas samoraim in two ways. First of all, it's a machlokas Rav Huna and Chia bar Rav as to whether or not there's preferential treatment to a churba for someone who made an eruv on one side versus someone who didn't on the other. Rav Huna says yes, it's preferred to the person who did not make an eruv. And the second is within the sheet of Chia bar Rav, which is whether or not he says that it would be mutter at all or completely asur. So those are double machlokas. One is between Rav Huna and Chia bar Rav, and the other is a split shita within the sheet of Chia bar Rav. And that brings us to the next Mishnah, and this Mishnah will take us, so the Mishnah is short, but the implications of it will take us to the bottom of the next Amud, a relatively short Amud, and a relatively short block. This Mishnah we've seen before. Now we're seeing it. We're in its appropriate Mari Makom. We're toward the bottom of Tzadi Beis Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. 3/4 of the way down. Gag gadol, samuch lekatan. You have a large roof that's close to a small roof. Hagadol muter ve'akatan asur. We'll see the context in the Gemara that the large gag, the large roof is mutter to use, and the small gag is usher to use. And similarly, though maybe extraneously, which is what the Gemara will ask momentarily, chatzer gedola shenifritz lektana. If you have a chatzer that's large and it broke into the wall between the chatzer that's large and the chatzer that's small, the wall broke in, and now you see access to the ktana. So the gedola is mutar, so you can carry within the gedola, but viktana asura. But when it comes to the small chatzer, they're not allowed to carry. Because really it's like the opening of the large one. And if you look from the inside, from the perspective of the ktana, so then it's basically like your whole wall broke down. So the gedola is allowed to carry. Now they have a new opening. But by the katan, this wall has to be less than 10 tefachim. But by the wall of the katan, their whole wall broke down, so that's not allowed. So the Gemara is bothered by this and says, Lama lila misnei tarte. Why does our Mishnah need both seemingly identical cases, one of Gag and one of Chatzer? In both cases, the gedola of them, either the Gag or the Chatzer, is allowed, and the Ketana of them is not allowed. So why do I need both cases? One, the case of Gag, and the case of Chatzer. And here the Gemara presents a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. It will be reminiscent of a shita that we saw earlier, both in regards to Rav and Shmuel. Why do I need the Mishnah to teach me both the case of Gag and the case of Chatzer? Because this is the second of the wide lines. Rav, according to Rav, Tani Gag dunya de Chatzer, he sees a comparison between a roof and a Chatzer. What do we learn about a Chatzer? What do we learn about a roof from a Chatzer? Says the Gemara. Ma Chatzer min milsa. Just like by a Chatzer, we need the walls to be recognizable. Af Gag nami min mechitza. We need on the roof for the walls to be recognizable. We spoke about this on Shabbos, that the walls, according to Rav, we don't say good asik unless the walls protrude a little bit above the flat of the roof. If it's flush, it's not good asik. We need to see the walls. So that was a din, says Rav, that we extrapolated from the fact that our Mishnah has both the case of Gag and the case of Chatzer. Shmuel, and according to Shmuel, Gag Dumya the Chatzer, he also makes a hekesh, a comparison between Gag and Chatzer. What do we learn about Gag from the world of Chatzer? So it says Shmuel, 4 lines from the bottom, Ma Chatzer de Kadarse la Rabim, Av Gag Nami de Kadarse la Rabim. It's one of the features that we look at in ruining a space is whether or not it's trampled a lot. So that's how Rav and Shmuel, respectively and differently, look at this Mishnah as to why we need both the case of Gag and the case of Chatzer. Again, Rav to teach us the din that on a roof, min milsa, we need to make sure that the walls are recognizable, and according to Shmuel, to make sure we learn the din of Darse le Rabin. So then the Gemara in the name of 3 Amoraim makes an extension of our Mishnah, and this throws us into a sugya that should take us a very long time to learn. As a rule, whenever you see short pages in large Tosusim, so then in Daf Yomi we get excited, but in Lumdus it means that there's a lot going on here, and there is a lot going on here. I'll try to keep it as clear as I can. And here is what the Gemara says, 3 lines from the bottom. Yasiv Rabba, Verab Zera, the Rabba Bar of Hanan. These are all 3rd century Amoraim, and they were Yasiv Abaye Gabayu. And their Rebbe Abaye was with them. V'yasve v'kamre, they were sitting and they said, Shma minami masnisin, what do we learn from our Mishnah? We learn as follows. Diyurek dola biktana. The ones who live in the large space have access to the small space. And the people who live in the small space, they don't have access to the large space. Ketzad, what are the applications of this? The Gemara is now going to present many and varied halachos that relates to this din. In effect, the klal gadol, the yesod of what we are going to say right now, is that when you have a large space that leads into a small space and the wall broke, it's as if there's a one-way valve going from the large space into the small space. How so? Let's take a look. Gifanim, if you have vines, bigdola, in the large space, so one-way valve, asr lizroa esaktana. As it relates to kiloi hakerem, you're not allowed to plant new grains in the kiloi ktana, because it's as if we view, it's like the doors of the saloons back in the day, though those may have been 2-directional. This is a one-way valve. It only opens inward to the ktana. So as we stand here in the Gdola and we look out, we have the vines by me. So can I plant kilayim in the other room? So because it's a one-way valve, it's as if it's open going from the Gdola to the Ktana. So what's the din? Asr lezara saktana. V'im zara. And if in fact you planted, zrayin asurin. That would not be allowed because it's a one-way valve and we view the Ktana as an extension of the review the Ktana as an extension of the Gdola. However, turning to the top of Tzadi Bezim and Bez, Gifanim Mutarim. But the Gifanim, which are in the Gdola, which are in the larger Chatzer, those are not problematic. Because again, it's a one-way valve. So whatever's happening in the Chatzer, Tana, you can't bring the issue back into the Gdola. So even though you planted grains in the Tana, it doesn't usher the vines. But it's still usher to plant the vines as it relates to the Gdola. A little bit along this. So what's happening in the Gedola is the primary. You go through the one-way valve all in one direction, then you're not allowed to plant in that space. But if you planted, those plants are bad. They're kilayim, but it doesn't ruin the Gefanim because it can't come back through the one-way valve. In other words, the primary space is the Gedola. The secondary space, almost the irrelevant space, is the Ketana. And that's the first example. Gefanim Biktana. What if you have the grapevines already planted and grown, and they're in the small ones? So because it's a one-way valve, we don't look into the Gdola, and therefore, mutter li zeros hagdola. I could plant grains all I want till I'm blue in the face, and the Gdola doesn't bother me a drop. No halachic issues whatsoever. That one-way valve, when we see a break in a wall between a large gog and a small gog, or a large chater and a small chater, the way that these three Amoraim understood as Rabbi and Reb Zera and Rabbi Baruch Hanan is that we look at it as though the Gdola is primary and the Ketana is secondary with that one-way valve. Okay, next case. Isha. If there is a woman whose husband is about to present her with a get, Isha bigdola, the get biktana. If the woman is standing in the large chatzer, and then she has the one-way valve, she has access into the ktana, and that's where her get is, and the din is miskareshes. She's divorced. She's ikr, and she can technically go into that space. However, Isha biktana the get bigdola. If you have a woman who's in the ktana and the get is in the gdola, one-way valve. She can't go into the Gdola. The Rishonim here dig into this idea, not in the language, of course, that I'm using, but the Rishonim specifically highlight here by get that there's something else going on, which is that it's a similar language, that the Rishus is not Iker, and the husband, she has to make a kinyan. V'nasan biyada, that's the pasuk in Dvarim, that she has to have it in her hand. That Rishus is not in her hand. That Rishus is inaccessible to her, and similar types of language. Okay, what about Tefillah b'tzibur? Says the Gemara, fourth line down, Tzadi Bezim and Bez. Tzibor bigdola. If you have most of the people, you've got a minyan of men davening in the large chatzer, v'shliach tzibor biktana, and the chazan's davening in the small space, yotzin yedei chavas, and they're fine. They're fine. They can go into the shliach tzibor. Okay. Tzibor biktana, if the 10 people are in the small space, the shliach tzibor bigdola and yotzin yedei chavasan, because they can't go back in. They're stuck. They're basically stuck. It's a one-way valve. So they're in the Ketana. They can't get to the Chazan, so they're done. Maybe there's 9 and 1, whatever the Maseches is. So that's not allowed. Now, again, similarly, continuing, 1/3 of the way down, Tisha bigdola b'yachid bigtana, 9 and 1, large to small, mitzdarfin, that works, but the reverse doesn't work. Tisha bigtana b'yachid bigdola, ein mitzdarfin. What about Tzoa? We know, of course, that there's a din. It's based on the pasuk of Kadosh, that it's usher for a person to daven in front of Tzoa. The Rishonim discuss what Tzoa is as it relates to baby diapers, right? I did a bris today, and right before the bris, the baby left me a wonderful gift. Thank you very much. Can I make a bracha now? It's within Dalet Amos. I happen to have had a mask on, and I couldn't smell it, but in theory, even if it's within Dalet Amos, it's no nafkamina. So the poskim are mechalik. That's not Tzoa. Tzoa requires a real, you have to have an achila for a Tzoa. The milk is not considered enough to make it a Tzoa. So even if it smells bad, even if it's within Dalet Amos, it's not considered Tzoa. And Ladina, you're allowed to make a bracha. Otherwise, you have to get, excuse me, can someone please take away the diaper? I'm making a bracha. The father's making a bracha. Afterwards, you do the brachas on the coast. So they got to be careful. So how does Tzoa relate here? Tzoa b'gedola. Let's say that there's Tzoa, that there's someone had gone to the bathroom, b'gedola, and that's in the large chatzer. So then, aser likros kriya shma b'ktana, because the Tzoa follows you. Okay, Tzoa biktana, mutter likros kriya shma b'gdola. But if the Tzoa is in the ktana, it cannot access you one-way valve, and therefore you're allowed. So these are applications of the Yesod that these three Amoraim wanted to recommend to Abaye. And they were basically saying, that's what we learned from our Mishnah, that the Iker premises is the larger Chater or Gag, and it has an appendage nature. The Ketana has an appendage nature, kind of like that one-way valve, where it's treated very differently based. And by the way, Gittin is a din d'oraisa, right? a woman cannot remarry if she's in the Ketana and the get is in the Gdola. But reverse, she can remarry. These are real, like, fundamental dinim. What?
I believe even the soul is in theorizing.
Oh, I didn't know that.
No?
No idea.
But are we talking about, this is on Shabbos?
Well, right now, what we're talking about is a whole bunch of other areas just applied from the klal of our Mishnah. Because our Mishnah taught us that there's a difference between a chatzer gadol and a chatzer katan. So the Amoraim said, I'm going to take that and run with it. And here are 5 examples.
Right.
You've got gefanim, you've got chazen, you've got 9 and 1, you've got an isha that's getting divorced, and you've got the so. They're just applying it to other areas of just. But the concept is that this one-way valve concept where if I'm in the Chatzer Gdol and you're in the Chatzer Ktana, so I can access you, but you cannot access me. And that's what they were saying to Abaye. So then Abaye responds, Abaye says, hold on one second. Amar lahu Abaye, Im Kain, if what you're saying is true, Matzinu mechitza le'isr, we have found a mechitza to cause more problems than less. How so? Shel malei ein mechitza, had there been no walls at all, had there been nothing separating the Chatzer Gdola from the Chatzer Ktana, marchik dalat amos v'zoreya. What would I do out the world of Kilei HaKerem? Just dalat amos. That's it. Yet now that I have to interface with you in the Chatzer Ktana, v'ilu hashda asura, now that there are these like stubbles of brick that are protruding into the entry within the Chatzer Ktana and Gdola, now what? So says Abaye, it's not right. The mechitza is causing more problems than solutions. I could have planted and it would not have been Kilei HaKerem. So Amar le Reb Zera la Abaye, I don't understand. We have precedent for that. We've seen mechitzas cause problems, and for this we're going to need the picture in Rashi. Says the Gemara ve'anan chatzer gedola shenifrat tzalaktana. Our Mishnah writes that if you have a large chatzer and the large chatzer on one wall centered is where the katana connects, and that wall blows open. So let's say you have a large chatzer like this, and then it leads into a smaller one, and the wall breaks between them. So it says in such a case, Gedola muter suktana asura mipnei shekapischa shel gedola. This is exactly like our Rashi says. Now, that's what our Mishnah says. V'ilu hishkas kifufeha, had it been that the small, tiny extensions that existed by the Chatzer Ktana were extended lengthwise across the Chatzer Gdola. Take a look at the picture in your Rashi there. So my Rashi has the Chatzer Ktana on one side, Chatzer Gdola on the other side, and it says Gifufe on the tops and then on the bottom. If you were to extend a straight wall from the walls of the Chatzer Ktana and dissect the Chatzer Gdola into 3 pieces, Gdola Nami Asura, we would have also seen that the walls would have caused for problems. So that's what Reb Zera says back. That is what, is it Reb Zera? Yeah, that's what Reb Zera says back. It's interesting. Reb Zera was a Talmud. Maybe he wasn't a Talmud. Because Reb Zera was one of these Amoraim, so they were all still talking in the same room. I have to see how far apart they were. I don't know. I'm sure Abaye was older, but not by much. I'm not sure if they were a Talmud Chava relationship or a Talmud. I'm not sure. Either way, so Abaye bites back and says, no, we have precedent for that. Look at the picture in Rashi. Amar le, Abaye says back to Reb Zera, no. Hasam siluk mechitzos. So really what you're doing in that case is you're doing a siluk of mechitzos. You're creating a new space entirely. You're saying that it's mechitzos, but you've just created a new space. It's not exactly the same thing. So that's how the Gemara concludes here. Sikum hadvarim is that these 3 Amoraim laid out the case in front of them. There were questions posed by Abaye. They held their ground, and seemingly based on the Yesod in our Mishnah, we have extensions mida oraisa to many areas where we see that if you have a Chatzer Gdola that blends into a Chatzer Ktana, or as our Mishnah writes, a Gag Gadol that blends into a Gag Katan. In those cases, we would say that the larger space of either the Gag and Chatzer, as it blends into the smaller space, it's as if there's a one-way valve to trap you so that you can have access to the smaller space, but the reverse would not work. And we'll pick up from the bottom of Daf Tzadi Beis. Yeah, that's correct. Daf Tzadi Beis, Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. We'll pick up from there tomorrow night. Have a beautiful night.